The gavel never fell, but the sound of it echoed through Reverend Samuel Washington's mind as he watched three white men in expensive suits unfold a collapsible table on the front steps of Mount Zion Baptist Church. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered brick facade, shadows that seemed to reach toward the small crowd gathering on the sidewalk with growing alarm. One of the men, portly and red-faced, was already spreading papers across the makeshift desk, while his companions assembled a portable podium with practiced efficiency. "What in God's name is happening here?" Samuel's voice carried across the church lawn, his pastoral robes billowing behind him as he strode toward the intruders. The morning prayer service had been interrupted by shouting from outside, and now half his congregation was streaming through the oak doors, their faces etched with confusion and mounting anger. The portly man looked up from his papers, his pale eyes cold and calculating. "Reverend Washington, I presume I'm Harold Kellerman from Premier Auction Services. We're here to conduct a lawful sale of this property to satisfy unpaid homeowner association assessments." His voice carried the practiced tone of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. Samuel felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "This church has been in our community for 73 years. My grandfather laid the cornerstone with his own hands. There must be some mistake." "No mistake. Reverend, we have documentation from the Willowbrook Heights Homeowner Association indicating that this property owes $47,000 in unpaid assessments dating back to 2018. The legal notice was published in the county paper for 3 consecutive weeks, as required by law. Kellerman's fingers drummed against the table as he spoke, each tap echoing like a countdown. Behind Samuel, the congregation was growing larger by the minute. Elderly women in their Sunday best stood shoulder to shoulder with young families, their children clinging to their parents' legs as they sensed the tension in the air. Mrs. Dorothy Jenkins, 84 years old, and the unofficial historian of Mount Zion, pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her walker clicking against the concrete. "This is our sanctuary," she declared, her voice trembling with indignation. "My late husband helped build that steeple. My children were baptized in that baptismal font. You cannot just come here and steal our church." The second auctioneer, a younger man with slicked back hair and a too-wide smile, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we understand this is difficult, but this is a legal proceeding. The property will be sold to the highest bidder at 11 o'clock sharp. We recommend you gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises to avoid any complications." Samuel's hands clenched into fists. "Complications. This is theft. Plain and simple. We pay our bills. We pay our taxes. We've never received any notice from any homeowner association." His voice rose with each word, and the crowd behind him murmured agreement. Nevertheless, Kellerman continued, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "The debt stands. The HOA has the legal right to foreclose on properties with delinquent assessments. This auction is proceeding as scheduled." The morning air grew thick with tension as more community members arrived. Cars pulled up along the street, their occupants spilling out to join the growing crowd. Samuel recognized faces from other churches in the neighborhood, from the community center, from the local school board. Word was spreading through the Willowbrook Heights community like wildfire. Among the new arrivals was Margaret Thornfield, the president of the Willowbrook Heights HOA. Her silver Mercedes pulled up to the curb with the quiet purr of expensive engineering, and she emerged wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than most of the congregation members made in a month. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe chignon, and her pale blue eyes surveyed the scene with obvious satisfaction. "I see the notices have been properly served," she announced, her voice carrying across the churchyard with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I trust there won't be any disturbances during the legal proceedings." Samuel turned to face her, his dark eyes blazing with righteous anger. "Mrs. Thornfield, you know full well that this church predates your precious HOA by 50 years. We were here when this was farmland. We were here when your development was nothing but a developer's dream. By what authority do you claim jurisdiction over our property?" Margaret's smile was cold as winter frost. "By the authority of the county recorder's office. Reverend, when your church was incorporated into the Willowbrook Heights development boundaries in 2018, it became subject to our covenants and restrictions. You've ignored your obligations for 5 years, and now the bill has come due." The crowd behind Samuel erupted in angry voices. "This is our church!" someone shouted. "You can't just steal it," called another. The morning sun climbed higher, casting the scene in harsh light that seemed to emphasize the battle lines being drawn. Mrs. Jenkins stepped forward again, her walker scraping against the pavement. "Young lady, I've lived in this neighborhood longer than you've been alive. This church was here when your fancy houses were just cornfields. You have no right to come here with your papers and your lawyers and try to steal what belongs to God and this community." Margaret's expression hardened. "Mrs. Jenkins, is it the law doesn't care about your sentimental attachments? Property law is property law. Your church owes money, and that debt will be satisfied today, whether you like it or not." The third auctioneer, who had been setting up a sound system, tapped the microphone. The feedback squealed across the churchyard, a harsh electronic scream that seemed to mirror the tension in the air. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning the auction in 30 minutes. Please clear the area so potential bidders can inspect the property." Samuel felt the weight of 3 generations of faith pressing down on his shoulders. This church wasn't just a building. It was where his grandparents had been married during the Great Depression. It was where his parents had brought him as a child, where he'd learned to read using the worn Bible in the front pew. It was where he'd stood 10 years ago to deliver his first sermon as the newly ordained pastor, his voice shaking with nerves and hope. "We're not leaving," he announced, his voice carrying across the churchyard with quiet determination. "This is our church, our sanctuary, our home. If you want to sell it, you'll have to do it with us standing right here." The crowd behind him stirred, a low murmur of agreement rippling through the gathered congregation. Children who had been playing in the church playground stopped their games to watch the adults with wide, curious eyes. Teenagers who would normally be glued to their phones stood beside their parents, sensing that something momentous was happening. Margaret pulled out her cell phone, her manicured fingers dancing across the screen. "Harold, I think we may need additional security. The situation appears to be escalating." Kellerman nodded grimly. "I'll call the sheriff's department. We can't have the auction disrupted by protesters." "Protesters?" Samuel's voice rose in indignation. "We're not protesters. We're the rightful owners of this property, defending our church from what can only be described as theft." The morning was growing hotter, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. More cars were arriving, and the crowd was swelling beyond anything Samuel had seen since the church's 50th anniversary celebration. He recognized faces from across the community, people of all colors and backgrounds who understood that what was happening here was bigger than just one church. Young Marcus Williams, fresh out of law school and serving as the church's volunteer legal counsel, pushed through the crowd with a thick folder clutched in his hands. "Reverend Washington, I've been reviewing the documentation all morning. Something doesn't add up about these assessments." Samuel turned to him with hope flickering in his eyes. "What did you find?" "Marcus!" The HOA claims the church became subject to their authority in 2018 when the development boundaries were redrawn. But I've been through the county records, and there's no evidence that the church was ever formally notified of this change. More importantly, I found records showing that the church actually paid assessments in 2019 and 2020 before questioning the authority of the HOA to collect them. Margaret's face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. That's impossible. Our records show no payments received from the church. Marcus opened his folder and pulled out a stack of documents. I have copies of canceled checks, Reverend, made out to the Willowbrook Heights HOA and endorsed by your treasurer, Mrs. Thornfield. Check numbers 2847 through 2851, totaling $22,000. The crowd fell silent as the implications sank in. If the church had been making payments, then the debt claimed by the HOA was fraudulent. Samuel felt his heart racing as he realized the full scope of what they were facing. Those checks, Margaret stammered, her composure cracking for the first time. Those must be for something else. Perhaps building permits or utility deposits. Marcus shook his head. The memo line on each check clearly states HOA assessment payment, and I have the bank records to prove it. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder as they approached the church. Samuel's stomach clenched as he realized Margaret had followed through on her threat to call for law enforcement. The sight of police cars turning onto the street sent a ripple of tension through the crowd. 3 sheriff's cruisers pulled up to the curb, their red and blue lights flashing ominously in the morning sun. 6 officers emerged, their hands resting on their duty belts as they surveyed the scene. The lead officer, a grizzled veteran with gray hair and tired eyes, approached the group with measured steps. I'm Sheriff Bradley. I received reports of a disturbance at this location. What seems to be the problem? Margaret stepped forward immediately, her voice taking on the tone of someone accustomed to being treated as an authority figure. Sheriff, we're attempting to conduct a legal auction of this property to satisfy unpaid HOA assessments. These people are refusing to allow potential bidders access to the property. Sheriff Bradley looked around at the crowd, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. Reverend Washington, I presume I know this church. My grandmother was a member here for 30 years before she passed. What's your side of the story? Samuel felt a glimmer of hope. Sheriff Bradley, we're being told that our church owes $47,000 to an HOA that we never agreed to join. We've recently discovered evidence that we actually paid assessments in good faith for 2 years before questioning the authority of the HOA to collect them. This auction appears to be based on fraudulent claims. The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. That's a serious accusation. Reverend. Marcus stepped forward with his folder. Sheriff, I'm Marcus Williams, legal counsel for the church. I have documentation here that appears to show the church made payments totaling $22,000 that the HOA claims were never received. The checks were endorsed and deposited into the HOA's account. Sheriff Bradley examined the documents Marcus handed him, his expression growing more serious with each page. Mrs. Thornfield, can you explain these payment records? Margaret's face was flushed now, her carefully composed mask slipping completely. I don't have access to all the HOA's financial records here. This is a legal auction proceeding, and these people are interfering with it. The sheriff looked around at the crowd, which had grown to nearly 200 people. Children were sitting on their parents' shoulders to get a better view, and elderly church members had brought folding chairs from the fellowship hall. The atmosphere was tense, but peaceful, with the quiet dignity of people who knew they were fighting for something sacred. I'm going to need to see the complete financial records from the HOA before this auction can proceed. Sheriff Bradley announced, "If there's evidence of fraud, this becomes a criminal matter." Kellerman cleared his throat nervously. "Sheriff, we're under contract to conduct this auction today. We have bidders coming from 3 counties." "Then you'd better hope those records clear things up quickly," the sheriff replied, "because I'm not about to let an auction proceed based on potentially fraudulent documentation." Margaret's phone buzzed insistently, and she stepped away from the group to answer it. Samuel could hear her voice rising in agitation, though he couldn't make out the words. When she returned, her face was ashen. "There's been a development," she announced reluctantly. "The HOA board has called an emergency meeting for this afternoon to review the financial records." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Samuel felt his knees go weak with relief. But he knew this was just the beginning. The real battle would be fought in that boardroom, where the truth about the missing payments would have to be confronted. "Mrs." Jenkins raised her walker in triumph. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. This church has been blessed and protected for 73 years, and it will continue to be blessed and protected." Sheriff Bradley addressed the crowd. "I want everyone to remain calm and peaceful. This situation is being resolved through proper legal channels. I'm going to leave 2 officers here to ensure there are no disturbances while the financial records are being reviewed." As the immediate crisis passed, Samuel found himself surrounded by congregation members and community supporters. The morning sun was now high overhead, casting sharp shadows across the churchyard. The sound of the auctioneers packing up their equipment was like music to his ears. Young Maria Santos, a local reporter for the community newspaper, approached with her camera and notebook. "Reverend Washington, can you tell me what this means for the church and the community?" Samuel looked around at the faces surrounding him, faces that represented 3 generations of faith and community. "It means that justice still has a place in this world. It means that when people come together to defend what's right, they can overcome even the most powerful forces arrayed against them." The afternoon HOA board meeting was held in the community center, a modern glass building that sat at the heart of the Willowbrook Heights development. The room was packed beyond capacity, with members of the church congregation sitting alongside concerned neighbors and local officials who had gotten wind of the morning's events. Samuel sat in the front row, Marcus beside him with files spread across his lap. Behind them, the congregation filled every available seat, their presence a quiet but powerful reminder of what was at stake. The air conditioning struggled against the heat generated by so many bodies in one space. Margaret Thornfield sat at the head table with 4 other HOA board members, their faces grim as they reviewed the financial documents Marcus had provided. The tension in the room was palpable, broken only by the occasional whisper or the rustle of papers. Board member Janet Morrison, a local real estate agent, cleared her throat. "After reviewing the financial records provided by Mr. Williams, we have discovered significant discrepancies in our accounting practices." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Samuel felt his heart pounding as he waited for the full revelation. It appears that payments totaling $22,000 were indeed received from Mount Zion Baptist Church between 2019 and 2020. These payments were deposited into the HOA's general fund, but were not properly credited to the church's account. A murmur ran through the crowd. Samuel felt Marcus tense beside him as the implications became clear. Morrison continued, her voice growing stronger. "Furthermore, our investigation has revealed that additional funds totaling $35,000 appear to have been diverted from the general fund to a private account controlled by the HOA president." The room exploded in shocked voices. Margaret Thornfield shot to her feet, her chair clattering backward. This is preposterous. I've dedicated 5 years of my life to this community. These accusations are completely unfounded. Board member Thomas Chen, a retired accountant, stood up with a thick folder in his hands. Mrs. Thornfield, we have bank records showing regular transfers from the HOA account to an account in your name. The timing of these transfers corresponds exactly with assessment payments received from various properties in the development. The color drained from Margaret's face. Those transfers were for legitimate HOA expenses. I used my personal account to pay contractors and suppliers. Then you'll have receipts and invoices to document these expenses. Chen replied calmly. Our preliminary review suggests that many of these payments were never actually made to contractors. The money appears to have been diverted for personal use. Samuel felt the weight of vindication settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about the church anymore. This was about systemic fraud that had affected the entire community. Families had been paying assessments that were being stolen by the very person they trusted to manage their funds. Sheriff Bradley, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room, stood up. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're hearing tonight suggests criminal activity. Mrs. Thornfield, you have the right to remain silent, but I need you to come with me for questioning. Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. You can't arrest me. I'm the president of this HOA. I've done nothing wrong. Her voice rose to a hysterical pitch as 2 deputies approached her. Ma'am, you're not under arrest at this time, but we need to ask you some questions about these financial irregularities. You have the right to have an attorney present. As Margaret was escorted from the room, the remaining board members looked shell-shocked. Morrison cleared her throat again. In light of these revelations, the HOA board votes unanimously to cancel the auction of Mount Zion Baptist Church. All claims against the church property are hereby withdrawn. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Samuel felt tears streaming down his face as congregation members embraced him and each other. Mrs. Jenkins was crying openly, her walker forgotten as she hugged anyone within reach. Marcus leaned over to Samuel. It's over, Reverend. The church is safe. But Samuel knew it wasn't really over. The community would need time to heal from this betrayal. Trust would need to be rebuilt. And there would be legal proceedings to endure as the full extent of Margaret's fraud was uncovered. In the days that followed, the story made headlines across the region. The attempted auction of a historic black church based on fraudulent claims sparked outrage and soul-searching about the abuse of HOA power. Margaret Thornfield was formally charged with embezzlement and fraud, with prosecutors estimating that she had stolen over $200,000 from the community over 5 years. The church itself became a symbol of resistance and community solidarity. Donations poured in from across the country, allowing the congregation to make badly needed repairs to the building and establish a legal defense fund for other communities facing similar challenges. Samuel stood in the sanctuary 3 months later, preparing for the Sunday service that would mark the church's 73rd anniversary. The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the worn wooden pews. The same pews where his grandparents had worshipped, where his parents had brought him as a child, where he had learned the meaning of faith and community. The congregation filed in, their faces reflecting the quiet joy of people who had fought for something precious and won. Mrs. Jenkins took her usual seat in the 3rd row, her walker parked beside her as she smiled at the children playing in the front pews. Marcus sat with his young family, his legal victory having earned him recognition as a rising star in civil rights law. Sheriff Bradley was there too, sitting with his wife in the back row. He had become a regular attendee since the crisis, drawn by the same sense of community and purpose that had sustained the church through its darkest hour. As Samuel stood to deliver his sermon, he looked out at the faces before him and felt the weight of history and hope. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying easily through the sanctuary, "we gather today not just to worship, but to celebrate the power of truth and justice. We have learned that when people come together in common cause, when they stand up for what is right, they can overcome even the most powerful forces arrayed against them." The congregation murmured agreement, their faces reflecting the hard-won wisdom of people who had faced adversity and emerged stronger. This church has stood for 73 years as a beacon of hope in our community. It has weathered storms and celebrated triumphs. It has been a sanctuary for the weary and a fortress for the faithful. And today, it stands as a testament to the truth that justice delayed is not justice denied. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the churchyard where just months before, auctioneers had tried to sell away the dreams and prayers of 3 generations. The shadows fell differently now, softer somehow, as if the very light had been touched by the grace of vindication. In the weeks that followed, the Willowbrook Heights HOA was dissolved and reformed with new leadership and strict financial oversight. The stolen funds were recovered and returned to the community, allowing for improvements to parks, playgrounds, and common areas that had been neglected during Margaret's reign. The church itself became a gathering place for the entire community, hosting voter registration drives, community meetings, and cultural events that brought people together across racial and economic lines. The crisis had revealed not just the potential for corruption and abuse, but also the incredible strength that emerged when people stood together for justice. Samuel often reflected on the morning when it all began, when 3 men in expensive suits had tried to steal away the heart of his community. He thought about the moment when Mrs. Jenkins had raised her walker in defiance, when Marcus had produced the evidence that would save the church, when the congregation had stood firm in the face of injustice. The church bells rang out across the neighborhood each Sunday morning, calling the faithful to worship and reminding everyone who heard them that some things are worth fighting for. The sound carried across the development, past the houses where families were learning to trust again, past the community center, where transparent governance was slowly being rebuilt, past the courthouse where justice had ultimately prevailed, and in the sanctuary of Mount Zion Baptist Church, where the morning light still streamed through stained glass windows and children still played in the front pews. The legacy of faith and resistance continued to grow stronger with each passing day.